Mr. President and the host of this St. Petersburg summit, your hometown that we need to recognize as well. I'd like to ask the first question from the podium, then I'll take the seat. Both of you, Chancellor Merkel and President Putin, addressed the meeting at the G8. You have the chairmanship of the G20 in September here in St. Petersburg. At the G8, a great deal of focus on global trade and the possible US-EU alliance there. There's a great deal of discussion on offshore taxation, and something you talked about in your opening remarks. And we know the differences on Syria. I'd like to talk about foreign policy a little bit later. What is the key priority, though, for you at the G20 in September here? There was an absence of discussion about how to boost global growth at this stage. Do you change that priority now for the G20, or do you have a different priority in mind, sir?
I think that Federal Chancellor will confirm what I am saying. During the debate at the G8 in Great Britain, we discussed two main areas that have to do with continuity in our work. First, continuity with what our Mexican friends and partners did during the previous G20 at Los Cabos. And after our meeting in Great Britain, we focused on some aspects of the development of the global economy, and they too will in some way be reflected in the agenda of the G20 in St. Petersburg in September. What is it that we were discussing? We were discussing how to create the best conditions, the best possible conditions for the development of global economy. That concerns taxation, that concerns offshoreization of the global economy. We know that this component was one of the negative things that led to the financial and then the economic crisis in 2008-2009. We also discussed what needs to be done in order to expand the horizons of trade, given that international trade saw some shrinking over the past couple of years. We also discussed coordinating our positions on these and other important aspects of the development of global economy. Of course, we also discussed the situation in each of our countries, the situation in the United States, the situation in the Eurozone, the situation in Russia. And each G8 leader told his partners what is being done nationally, domestically. President Obama talked about amendments to the tax laws in order to address the threats of offshoreization. So this is the kind of natural common field of our work, of our discussion, where we focused on urgent problems and problems of mutual interest. As for foreign policy, international politics, issues such as Syria, while we did discuss Syria, it is probably the problem of greatest urgency today. We discussed other problems as well. It was an open discussion. We showed, as stated, we reaffirmed, as stated in our joint declaration, that our main aim and concern is to end violence in Syria as soon as possible, create conditions to resume political dialogue between the parties to the conflict, and also to make sure that the parties that are currently in a military armed conflict sit down together and negotiate. We agreed that Geneva II, the Geneva II Conference on Syria, should be convened as soon as possible, based on the principles affirmed during the previous meeting in Geneva. We should encourage the sides, the parties to the conflict, to engage in dialogue and to achieve positive results. The discussion on this issue and on other issues was a discussion among interested parties, among partners, and there were different opinions stated during that discussion, during that debate, but I was happy to note that despite the depth and the complexity of the problems that we discussed, we were looking for a way to compromise. And practically on all of the issues that we discussed, we did find a consensus.
Mr. President, I was going to talk to you about foreign policy a little bit later, but since you brought up Syria, just a quick follow-up, if I may, and I'll go to Chancellor Merkel thereafter. Is it possible to have a Geneva II discussion taking place when Russia on one side is providing arms, and you're very clear about that, to the Assad regime? The United States has chosen the other side, and we have division amongst the G7 overall on where to proceed. What's the tactical way to go forward? So is it possible to have a Geneva II when you have that sort of division? Arms going in, support from Iran on one side, the United States picking the other side, sir.
Well,
it seems to me that as regards supplies of weapons, I spoke about that at the press conference in Great Britain. I can only repeat, the Russian Federation is not in violation of any norm of international law. Within the framework of international law, within the framework of open and transparent contracts, Russia is supplying arms to the legitimate government of the Syrian Republic. As for the other side, it has been receiving arms from abroad for a long time. Let me note that. Let us not talk about where those arms come from, but without arms supplies from abroad, what is happening now in Syria would have been impossible. They get money, they get weapons, and also there are well-trained detachments, military detachments of armed people, and they too come mostly from abroad. In Europe and also at the international arena, at the United Nations, decisions were taken that arms should not be supplied to non-governmental entities, particularly in areas of conflict. So there is indeed a certain difference of view between us and, let's say, the United States. But let me say that it's not just a difference between Russia and the U.S. It's not just U.S. position and just Russia's position. Let me assure you that all G8 participants are sovereign states and their leaders are sovereign world leaders, and they have their own opinion about the current problem in Syria and other problems. And when people indicate that it's Russia on the one hand and the United States on the other hand, it's a very simplistic view of a very complex international process. Let me repeat what I said in Great Britain. I can't imagine why weapons should supply to those illegal armed formations in Syria, which include people whom we fully do not know and do not understand. If the United States and the State Department recognize that one of the key opposition organization, al-Nusra, is a terrorist organization, officially recognized as terrorist, which is linked to al-Qaeda, how can they give weapons to that part of the opposition? Where will those weapons end? What is going to happen? There are at least 600 people from Russia and Europe fighting with the opposition today. So where will those weapons end up? There are no answers to this question as yet. When we ask our partners, they cannot answer. So it's not as simple as some people would suggest. We believe that our position is well-founded, it's carefully balanced, and we believe that only the Syrian people themselves can guarantee a long-term solution of all the problems that have piled up there during the decades before. And we, acting from outside, can only create conditions to achieve such agreements.
Thank you for your response. Chancellor Merkel? I'd like to circle back to the G8 agenda. You talked about the tendency for protectionism, and we saw that during the financial crisis in the last 3 years. Is it realistic to suggest that the European Union, the United States, could enter into serious, genuine talks with the resistance that we're seeing from France on the media sector and the film sector, and the fact that we're not certain that the Conservative Party in the UK actually wants to stay in the European Union? Doesn't seem like the best conditions to form a concrete path forward for trade.
Thank you very much. I would like, if I may, say briefly something on Syria. The inherent value in meetings such as G8 is, after all, that one wishes to reconcile different opinions in such a way that the international community is capable of action. If each and everyone were of one and the same opinion, there would not be international conflict. So in this way, the G8 meeting, and although we do have differences of opinion, and there are differences of opinion also between Germany and Russia, I thought that this was a good meeting because we were able to clearly define what we thought was important. None of the members wishes to support terrorist forces. Secondly, the question whether chemical weapons have in effect been used is being investigated by the United Nations, and one wishes a second Geneva conference in order to get a transition government in Syria, which is supported by all of the different opposition forces. And each and everyone works to lend his contribution towards bringing about these goals, then we have perhaps a small chance to alleviate the untold suffering of hundreds and thousands of people and to prevent an instability of the region. We're going to address that, after all, later on in our talks. Secondly, I am very grateful to the OECD that in the area of tax evasion, tax avoidance, and also shaping taxes aggressively, that they have built up a list of criteria which enable us now to address this. And in G20, for example, we are given a great legitimacy. I think it's a question of fairness, of justice, also for the people in our country. They see it's not just one person that is footing all the bill in the context, for example, of the Eurozone, people that cannot take their money and go somewhere else, whereas others, where capital is very mobile, can go somewhere else, can go to a tax haven whenever there's a complicated situation in their home state. We will not be able to achieve cohesion in the world today. We will not be able to get credibility among the people if there are only a few who actually benefit from growth. Now, as regards the context with the United States and the free trade agreement between the EU and the US, the US has concluded a number of free trade agreements, for example, with Korea. Media, cultural issues were never covered by these agreements. So it's a long-standing tradition for the European Union that these parts were not considered to be parts of the free trade agreements. Obviously, because of the strength of the United States of America, particularly in the media sector, it's a very interesting sector. They have vested interest there, and this is why the Europeans are all the more concerned that they might be sort of overwhelmed, as it were, by this strong sector. And actually, the position that was taken is a position that the European Parliament rallied round before the start of the negotiations. I think it's very encouraging that the United States said we're not even starting with the negotiations under these conditions, but we've said if at a certain point in time later on this issue comes to the fore again, then obviously it needs to be addressed. As regards the United Kingdom, my attitude here is very clear. The United Kingdom is part of the European Union. It is enriching us. Sometimes they criticize the European Union, sometimes a very justified criticism has been voiced by them, sometimes not. But wherever the European Union tends to become a little bit too bureaucratic, a little bit too slow and cumbersome, the UK can be a very good driver behind an opposite movement. And the United Kingdom has great advantages that it draws from the single market, as do we. And then we need to, if there is controversy, address that together with our partners, also with those in the party that you mentioned. But again, I'm also saying, on the other hand, the United Kingdom in and of its own, somewhere between the EU and the United States, that is something that is unimaginable to me.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. Okay, I have one quick follow-up question for both of you, because this is an economic summit, so I need to ask an economic question to each, and then I'm going to go directly to the floor. First, for President Putin. We saw a very serious reaction after the U.S. Federal Reserve suggested that the policy may be adjusted by the end of 2013 in terms of the bond purchases. A very violent reaction in stock markets around the world, but particularly in emerging markets. What countermeasures are needed by Russia with a new central bank governor, to boost growth if there's that much worry about Federal Reserve Board policy, particularly in a country like this?
То, что Россия может и должна сделать.
What Russia can and should do in order to increase economic growth has been discussed in my speech, in my remarks, as to the reaction to the statement of Mr. Bernanke. Statements of this kind for us are expected. Adjustment would need to happen at some point. You cannot just pump liquidity into the market without end, without addressing the fundamental tasks that need to be addressed in order to correct the situation. What President Obama has been able to do on the budget is very good, and certainly that he was able to avoid the fiscal cliff. He certainly won an economic victory, and that's very much to his credit. But it is not right to have the entire world expecting just what is going to happen going from one fiscal cliff to another. There needs to be a fundamental decision, and Federal Reserve adjustment needs to happen at some point. It was not a surprise for us. I think it's a decision going in the right direction. We need to get out of this situation which happened over the past years. The debt burden of the federal budget needs to be reduced. Other debt obligations need to be reduced. And President Obama spoke quite frankly about this during the G8, and I believe it's a healthy decision. So I think that the reaction of the market was also to be expected. I think the adjustment of the policy will happen as soon as there is real awareness that American and international economy is being put on a healthy basis. That is only for the good.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mrs. Merkel, before I go to the floor here, you talked in your opening remarks about having to pursue a policy of growth in Europe right now. It's very important. But you also added it needs to be along with sound fiscal policies as well. Now, you know the criticism aimed at Germany that the policies that are good for Germany are not necessarily good for the southern half of Europe. Youth unemployment of above 50% in Greece and in Spain right now. Fiscal consolidation would mean greater competitiveness, but there is no growth in southern Europe. Is there a willingness on behalf of Germany now to adjust those policies because of the pain that's being inflicted on those in southern Europe in particular, and particularly those in the next generation? Is there a change of policy that is necessary?
Let me make a brief comment on just the previous topic that you addressed. I do agree that that timeline that had been indicated by the president of the Fed is a right timeline. Because we should not forget that very high liquidity really was the cause of the past financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, and we must in no way at all head for another such crisis. And therefore, I think the reactions show that we have not come back to a full global balance, because when you're talking about sustainable growth in all world regions, then that would also mean that any announcements of central bankers should not cause those dramatic fluctuations and should not actually cause those price changes. So this tells you how much that global economy depends on the action of central banks. In an otherwise calm and sustainable situation, that obviously would not happen to that extent. So that shouldn't stop us to return back to the normal and sustainable path of development that we should aim for. And secondly, the big deficits have led to a situation where in many parts of the world, people were adhering to the slogan of parts of the European sovereign bonds are nothing to invest in, right? And what would be the lesson that you learn from that? Well, we have consulted the IMF, the ECB, the European Commission. We've developed a number of programs for countries that were in difficulties. Now, basically everything that the world community had to offer in terms of expertise went into that. That wasn't Mrs. Merkel from Germany that negotiated that process. It was 3 international institutions with a reasonably good reputation, together with those countries in question. In Eastern Europe, in the Baltic states, countries had similar negotiations, although were not part of the Eurozone, or they have taken similar measures. Now, following a time of rather difficult development, have returned on a growth path. And therefore, I'm convinced that if we do fiscal consolidation and structural reform, then also in Southern Europe, we will be in a position to return to that path. And basically, it's not about just austerity. Greece had a deficit of 14%. No one was buying any sovereign bond from them. So you have to do something in that situation. And secondly, we're talking about a broad-based structural reform system. Greece, with our support now, is going to develop a taxation system with the European help, also a better administration system. So they're straightforward, basic things. More privatization, for instance. Baby milk should not only be sold in a pharmacy, but also in a supermarket. I mean, things that would be self-evident in other parts of the world and are actually practiced there. So, of course, it is true that, especially for the public administrations who for many years have been benefiting from a number of situations or the status quo, it's very difficult for them to accept that necessary structural reform. But it's, I think, absolutely out of the question that those reforms are necessary. But now the question is, how can we evenly spread the burden of those changes? And this is very difficult in a globalized world. I mean, people just disappear. The ones that should be bearing that burden, and leave the people in the street to themselves. And therefore, actually, we're displaying solidarity within Europe. But that is solidarity based on our understanding that it's not going to bring Europe forward if we just say we're not going to tell anyone the truth or not going to hurt each other. This is going to work for a couple of years, but in 10 years' time, we will no longer be competitive. It's China, you hear it from Russia and from Brazil, from other countries, will not be looking on and see whether we are taking the right conclusions in Europe. If they can produce cheaper, better, more innovative, well, they obviously are going to do it, because those people want to live in prosperity as well. So I firmly believe that this is not just boiling down to the question of whether the euro will stick together, but it's about whether Europe in 20 years' time can still be innovative or not, or whether Europe will be an excellent holiday destination for people who just want to see where the automobile was invented and where the first big chemical plant was built. On the contrary, I want Europe to remain a prospering continent that can compete with the rest of the world, and therefore sometimes we have to be quite strict to one another.
Если позволите, я еще вернусь к первой части.
With your permission, I would add, it's not just the markets went down somewhat after the announcement of Mr. Bernanke. Gold also collapsed. Why did it happen? I think that people were expecting the strengthening of the dollar for the benefit of yuan, euro, and some regional currencies that would produce changes also in the commodities markets. And we should take that into account in our current economic policies. The question that you put to Madam Chancellor, it's of importance not only for the Eurozone, but also for us. I said in my speech that we need to find a balance, a combination of effective action in order to address the strategic tasks and also current operational tasks. In principle, it's about similar to what is happening in the Eurozone, addressing unemployment in the east and south of the Eurozone and stimulating growth as a whole. It's a similar kind of balancing, similar tasks, even though I can say I'm happy that our economic situation is healthier. Our unemployment rate is 5.5%. It's a historical minimum in our country. We have no debts. In practical terms, the external debt of the Russian Federation is 2.5%, 2.5%, whereas in the Eurozone it's up to 100%. If you look at the domestic debt, it's 10, 11%. We're at a historical minimum in terms of inflation. As I've said, it is somewhat higher now, but after the decisions related to putting a brake on the growth of tariffs of the national monopolies, I think that would strike a blow against inflation. So the basic starting conditions for growth are quite satisfactory. I'm not saying good, but quite satisfactory. But the problems is comparable to what the Federal Republic and other countries in the Eurozone have to tackle. So I agree with the Federal Chancellor. She knows my position. I believe that the approach where before making injections of whether it's honey or caviar, we should make sure that these nice things will not just vanish, will not just disappear. We need to do a lot in this regard.
Mr. Putin, thanks very much. I want to open the floor to questions. I'm looking for a quick question in particular on energy policy, because the President talked about the softness that we've seen in commodities and also economic policy. If we can have a microphone here into the center of the room. Mr. Jurgen, if you can stand up, would be great. And then I'm going to go to the other side of the room there to the left on about the fifth row. Dan Jurgen's got the floor.
Is it on? Yes. Thank you, Mr. President, Chancellor Merkel, for your addresses. Question for President Putin. Major technological developments are unfolding in the oil and gas industry relating to tight oil and shale gas that are affecting the energy balance, supply, potentially price. How do you see these developments affecting the Russian economy, and what kind of strategies does Russia have for addressing these new developments?
Изменения всегда происходят, и
Well, change is something that happens all the time, and the world adjusts to change in some way always. And it's true of our economy too. I do not see any cardinal change. The fact that in the American market there is now shale gas, it's a factor affecting the economy today, particularly the energy markets, but fundamentally we have not seen big changes. First of all, the cost of the production of shale gas is a multiple of the cost of normal gas production. And secondly, the changes related to environmental protection. It's very well known that where shale gas is produced, people, not always, but very often, see something black in their tap water instead of water. And therefore, production of shale gas, because it's related also to explosions, requires large territories, one explosion, another explosion, and those territories can no longer be used for the economy, and they are in terrible shape afterwards. Of course, those technologies will improve, but as of today, producing shale gas and then perhaps shale oil, which is also possible, this production also is possible. So the ultimate price for the consumer is $120 per 100 cubic meters. And if you add here liquefaction and then deliquefaction, transportation, then for the European market, that would mean up to $350 or $450 per 1,000 cubic meters. That is the price at which today Gazprom sells pipeline gas to its main consumers, mostly in Europe. It's about the same. For the American market, this would give some positive results, at least today. But for the world natural gas energy market, I do not see serious change as yet. What we need to do together, as I said today when I spoke about energy to the energy people, we need to think about cardinal changes in the technology. If together we are able to produce that, then it'll be a breakthrough. We should assume that cheap energy will not be available, that we need to go to those reserves that are difficult to extract, that will cost more, that will also require new technology. And new technologies will be a great step in developing world energy.
Another question from the floor, I think there in the fifth row, if we can get the microphone there. And if I can see another hand here, in the second row, if we can get a microphone for the gentleman afterwards. It's Jim Turley of Ernst & Young.
John, thank you, and both of you, thank you for your comments. And this is for President Putin. Russia has, over the last decade, a very well-deserved reputation for fiscal discipline and prudence. And you've touched on this a little bit prior, but if you be a little more granular, as the economy has slowed here, how do you plan to balance the need for stimulating growth with the need to really maintain that discipline that you've earned so well over the last 10 years?
Я уже говорил в своем выступлении, несколько моментов просто.
I would like to say a few words, and I would like to draw your attention to a number of factors. We need to achieve a drastic reduction in inflation. We need to create fundamental preconditions for economic growth. Secondly, we're going to develop our banking system, and based on the solution of the first issue, we are going to reduce interest rates. We will enhance the accessibility to credit resources, both for large-scale companies and for small and medium-sized enterprises. We're going to reduce the administrative burden, and we will reduce costs, and we will develop the infrastructure. Those projects that I mentioned are just the top of the iceberg. We are going to work in many other ways as well. Of course, this requires a lot of resources, but this task is mutually exclusive. But we will be trying to create and to preserve basic preconditions for economic growth, and also at the same time ensure investments into infrastructure. And everybody is talking about now investments in human capital, enhanced level of education, improvements in the healthcare. We have developed a lot of programs to that effect.
Thank you, Mr. Putin. We had another question from the second row. Please, if you can identify yourself.
Jochen Wermuth, German investor in Russia. A happy investor, I have to say. Over $1 billion invested and able to do it in a normal fashion. Thank you very much for the excellent reception here. Thank you very much for your indication of the great cooperation between the G8 heads of state and your commitment to Europe and Russian-European cooperation. So my question to both of you is on Russian-EU strategic partnerships. In these rooms here, I think it was a few years ago in 2005, German Gref and Peter Mandelson negotiated the 4 common spaces between the EU and Russia, a space for economic space where we have free movement of goods, a space of freedom and security.
Just in the essence of time, I don't mean to be rude. I need to get to the question, please.
Exactly. The question is, could we now, the precondition for the 4 common spaces, freedom, movement of goods, security and education, to be implemented was that Russia would join the World Trade Organization. Now, 8 years later, it has happened. Could we go back to the plans of 2005 and implement the 4 common spaces between Russia and the EU to come to a genuine strategic partnership for growth for Russia and the EU? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mrs. Merkel, would you like to take that first?
Ich glaube, dass das Potenzial.
I think that the potential of partnership between the European Union and Russia has not been fully utilized. And I think it's a very important step for Russia to have become a member of the WTO. There are regularly consultations. In some areas, we've made progress. As far as the cooperation is concerned, I've already talked about the energy cooperation, and it's not only Germany that is an important partner. I think yesterday we had the Dutch Prime Minister here. There are many countries, France, for instance, that are very intensely collaborating, working together with Russia. And of course, there are things that have not been solved yet. Russia would wish for faster progress in the visa waiver program, and I'm quite open about that. So we are too slow, says Russia in that, and we have to make progress also as far as the free movement of economic cooperation is concerned, so those people that are engaged in economic cooperation. And we're also returning to discussions on human rights that are that we are at dispute, and sometimes that dispute can be quite significant, but if you look at the long-term strategic necessities, let me say, as someone who is a European in the sense of the European Union, that partnership with Russia, I think, is a central strategic role that it's playing. So obviously any setbacks, any questions or issues should not be in our way. We have to settle them, those disputes, and it's well known that the Russian president is not someone that is keeping his voice down, but indeed speaks up on regular occasions, and that does not stop us from continuing those efforts in the future.
Громко приходится выражаться для того, чтобы услышали. Но если...
We have to say lofty words to be heard. Maybe I was talking too loud, but I would like to apologize for that. But I don't know why we should come back to 2005. Madam Federal Chancellor was 100% right when she said that Russia acceded to WTO when Mandelson and Gref, the most important, they held their negotiations, and their most important task was to ensure Russia's accession to WTO. There are lots of misunderstandings. There are lots of things that need to be harmonized. I mean, our joint principles in the field of humanitarian rights. We need to understand how to ensure human rights, how to protect them, what values we share. A lot of things need to be agreed. A lot of things need to be understood. But what is very important, we need to be very attentive to one another. We need to treat each other with respect. And Russia is always ready to hear, to listen to our partners, but under the condition that no one dictates their rules to us in a mentoring tone. Well, I would like to say that I haven't seen such examples over the past several years. One thing is mass media, where we have emotional people who are not very well informed about what happens in real life. They have a lot of assumptions of their own, and this is something for the administrative bodies to take the blame for, because if we inform the mass media in the timely manner, we won't have all those rumors circulating. Well, yes, there are lots of debates about ways of economic development, because each country, each side is trying to achieve the best. The one who sells wants to sell at a higher price. The one who buys wants to buy at a lower price. This is nothing unusual about it. But we managed to come to a common solution. We have acceded to the WTO, and now head of another organization, international organization, is here in the auditorium. He is a good friend of ours, and we are thinking together with him how to resolve the problem of Russia's accession to OECD. Even if it doesn't happen tomorrow, we understand that we need to harmonize our domestic internal rules with OECD rules and standards. We are working on a regular basis. I'm not going to give you any dates, but the important thing is that we listen to one another, we hear what the other side has to say. We have debates going on with the European Union about the third energy package. We haven't been able to come to terms to them, but as Madam Chancellor said, that we built the northern pipeline together, and I think here we have very deep interests of our own. Consumption is going to grow in China, in Japan. Europe is faced with certain difficulties, but the responsibility of European leaders will lead to the recovery of this very important segment of the global economy, and Europe is the biggest partner of Russia. We have more than 400 billion of turnover, trade turnover with European countries. So we are moving towards achieving all those goals that we formulated for ourselves several years ago.
We'll go back to the floor in a second. I have a question for Mrs. Merkel. Big decision last night overnight. EU finance ministers decided to recapitalize banks, but there was a caveat put forward by Germany that national governments need to share the burden. My question for you, Chancellor, is won't this shut out the economies that need it most? Because the state can't afford this in Spain, Italy, Portugal, Greece, for example, the recapitalization of the banks. Are you satisfied that it'll do what it's needed to do?
Ich denke, dass natürlich damit
No, I think what we can achieve with that is precisely what we have planned to do. Because within the European Union, we are not a national state. We are a community of many national states. And what is important for me and for Germany is that the question of liability, so joint liability, and joint enforcement, so decision-making, should be in a one-stop organization. You cannot say you're recapitalizing European banks, whereas the German Federal Chancellor cannot influence that decision in terms of how a bank in Spain, Portugal will be recapitalized, because that, again, would be in the responsibility of the national authorities. Basically, we need to match things together. The European treaties at the moment are as such, and most European countries do not want to change those treaties because this is very complicated to do. So therefore, we must make sure that with the treaties that we have, we apply them in the correct direction. And if we get more enforcement rights in terms of European institutions, well, we have to be ready to change those, to amend those treaties. Now, when it comes to the recapitalization of banks, the issue here at hand is, and I haven't seen it in writing yet, that decision, the agreement was on a sequence of who, in case of difficulties of a bank, is in charge of recapitalizing that bank. After the financial crisis, we said it shouldn't always be the taxpayer, no matter whether it's the German or some other taxpayer, stands in for that liability whenever a bank is in dire straits. And there we work towards that, like the G20, that we're never going to get a situation where a bank is too big to fail. Because you're too big, you can foist upon any taxpayer in the world the liability to bail us out. So we need a cascade of responsibilities. Now, what happens if the bank itself is not in a position, and also the base capital, the equity of the bank is not sufficient? What will happen in that scenario? Now, in such a case, in order to avoid worse consequences for the economy, the state has to come in. And if the state cannot do that, well, then we have our European solidarity mechanisms, but only as a last resort. And then the state has to apply to the ESM and say, you know, I need support here. And part of the volume of the ESM is then also going to be available for this purpose. But only we as governments can actually demand from governments that the business of the business has to be changed, the size has to be amended. You know, obviously, as a German chancellor, I cannot get a stake in a bank elsewhere and say you'll have to fire people, you have to change your business model, etc. This is not how it's going to work, and therefore the political responsibility, whereas I'm responsible for the money of the German taxpayer, and elsewhere governments are in charge of other taxpayers' money. So therefore, we have to be also accountable to our own taxpayers. Wherever we are using our tax funds, we have to get something out of it and get enforcement of those funds. And I can only do that together with my colleagues. Or you're completely changing treaties, you are granting the rights to the ECB or some other institutions, European institution, that would have a way to enforce those measures. But, you know, if that happens, before that happens, governments will have to seize the authority they have over their savings banks or other national banks to a supranational organization. So Germany is indeed for solidarity, that is true. But solidarity means is that the liability risk that you're taking is part of your decision-making powers and is also legitimized by Parliament. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask our host, before I give you the microphone, Mr. President. I don't want to be accused.
The Federal Chancellor stated that So far, she doesn't know who's responsible for the recapitalization of the distressed banks. But at the same time, she mentioned that sometimes I'm very outspoken in telling what I think, so I will whisper. I hope that it's not going to be at the expense of the customers.
Vita Unicredit Milano, Axel Springer Berlin. Eine Frage an Frau Bundeskanzlerin.
I have a question to Madam Federal Chancellor, Giuseppe Vita from Springer in Berlin. You just said how actually limited the opportunities you have in Europe to actually enforce what you have just said. But when do you think we are going to see a European economic and political union? Because we're talking about 27 different countries with 27 different constitutions and 27 different constitutional courts and 27 different ministers of defense. I mean, that is a weakness. Only a political union can really be strong, I think.
Ja, ich glaube, dass eine politische Union.
I think a political union in which all those competences, Mr. Vita, that you've just mentioned, would be pooled in the sense of a European government. So such a political union will take a long time until it comes into being, because we have already ceded some competences to the European Union. So if we have an anti-dumping proceedings with China over solar panels, then I have to explain to the Chinese government first that I have only limited opportunity to speak up on that, because the entire responsibility is with Europe, and many decisions that have been taken with a qualified majority. So when I'm talking to some parts of the internal energy single market package, I'm not necessarily happy with, but we're voted out of that consent within Europe, and there we are. So I don't think you can actually win more force or more strength within Europe by delegating our authorities more and more to Europe. And in fact, this is one of the findings of the German federalism. You can do many things better by coordinating. It's not about derogating competences to others. We can always find multilateral arrangements that everyone adheres to, while still maintaining the specificity of the social legislation and others in every national government that have grown over the years. So for me, a European method is not only about ceding competences away to Europe, but also one of those European methods is to coordinate better among the group of European governments. Headquarters is not always better than a number of local decision-making situations. What is important, though, and that for me in Europe is an area where we need to convince people and to raise awareness, is that we have no legal claim to be good. Those who are good in this world is decided by competition, and not because we have been leaders for 150 years. We continue to be leaders, per se. And I think Europe, right now, is faced with a process of understanding that globalization is placing entirely new challenges in front of us, and we can only counter them together better, and only then can people have their specific share in problem solving. So I'm not pessimistic about more political collaboration, but the central super political state of Europe is not going to happen.
This is a pivotal issue that you've raised. Mrs. Federal Chancellor was very accurate in her statement, and I would allow myself a view from a side. You cannot imagine an effective operation of the single currency zone without a single budget, fiscal, and a single macroeconomic policy, particularly if the members of this union are the subject with different economic development levels. So how will this be done? Either some sort of a united government structure is going to be the United States of Europe, or is it going to be possibly done on the basis of different agreements? It really doesn't make a difference. The result is what counts. There are so many jokes that you can quote about it. No matter what you do during your first night after your marriage, the result should be always the same.
Okay, one quick question to Chancellor Merkel, one quick question for President Putin, and then we'll wrap it up. A very important decision overnight, Mrs. Merkel, and that was a move to block the accession talks for Turkey into the European Union after the protests that we saw, but the government response, which I understand affected you quite personally. You took it quite hard. Is this move irreversible, the accession talks with Turkey into the European Union, after what we saw?
Nein, wir sind ja in einem Prozess und es gibt verschiedene.
No, after all, we're in a process. There are different questions that are asked as regards the accession procedure with Turkey. There is one mandate that enables us to negotiate in a free and open way, and this mandate entails that new chapters are opened along the way. For a number of years now, we have not opened new chapters, and what is under discussion now is whether this is the right point in time, whether all of the technical preconditions are in place to reopen a new chapter. But there is no doubt that the negotiations as such will go on. We have a situation which is much, much more difficult than the one that we have right now, namely the problem that so far Turkey has not fulfilled the so-called Ankara Protocol, which means that Turkey, as regards all of the member states of the European Union, has to have the same quality of trade relations. And the problem of Cyprus looms large here on the horizon. And this is why certain chapters have not yet been opened, and no other chapter is closed. Because first and foremost, that is the issue that needs to be dealt with, the so-called Ankara Protocol. I made my public comments on what I saw happening on the streets in Turkey. I was shocked to see how they dealt with, how the authorities dealt with the demonstrators. The values that we share in Europe, the values that we have always defended, are essential, are crucial to us in Europe, and I think that something has happened in Turkey which was disproportionate. We will continue to address this, but the question whether another chapter will be opened or not, that's a totally different issue than whether the whole process as such will be stopped in its tracks. Next week there's going to be a decision what's going to happen, and I don't want to preempt the German position, but I do have a certain degree of skepticism. I think you have been able to glean that from what I said just now.
Indeed. Thank you very much for the answer. On a lighter note, Mr. President, I'd like to clear up one issue that came up in the last week or so. Let's roll back the clock 8 years to the visit of Robert Kraft to St. Petersburg and his Super Bowl ring. There was a meeting here, a shaking of hands, a ring passed from one person to the next. Was it a gesture that he gave you the ring? You thought it was a very nice ring. You said, thank you very much, and I will give a gift in kind. Let's clear up this international question of intrigue that's been circulating for the last 10 days. Thank you.
Вы знаете, я не помню ни господина.
I neither remember Mr. Kraft nor the ring, but if it, well, I do recall that certain souvenirs were handed over, but if this saw some big value for Mr. Kraft and for respective teams, I have a suggestion to make. I will ask our manufacturers to produce a really good, visibly valuable thing made out of very good metal and stone in it, and so that this object from generation to generation to be passed on within the team that is being represented by Mr. Kraft. I will say that this is going to be the smartest and most partner-like resolution of this very complex international problem.
Just let me extend my thanks for allowing me to host the presentation and the keynote address to Mr. Putin. Chancellor Merkel, thank you very much also for your words of wisdom in terms of your speech and taking the questions. I wish you could take more questions from the floor. We had an issue with time allocation, but thank you very much for the invitation, and success to the rest of the summit.
Я хочу обратиться к аудитории
And I would like to ask the audience to give a big hand to Mrs. Merkel for having found time to come to join us in this debate in St. Petersburg.